Hello everybody, my name's Philip and I'm from ZooLab, the UK's #1 animal handling and lifelong learning company. As I say at the start of all of these pre-recorded videos, thank you very much for buying it from us, but also it's a great shame that we can't be out with you face to face at the moment, but we're staying safe and we're hopefully be back out with you again soon. But thank you very much for buying this video. This video is all about life cycles, and once again we're going to be taking a look at some really exciting animals, some exotic animals that have some quite interesting life cycles, as well as perhaps mentioning other animals that also have important life cycles or sort of interesting life cycles as well. Now, for those of you that don't know, life cycles is all about the whole process of from birth to adult and then back round to birth, so through the reproductive cycle that sort of animals have. And so there are some animals that have a really interesting life cycle to bring them full circle from a baby to an adult and back round to a baby, and we'll be talking about some of these. And it is a circular sort of motion that sort of continues the circle of life, and that's why it's called that. And there are often sort of quite interesting stages along the way in the development of animals. Now, the first animal we're going to take a look at is in fact an interesting creature which has a relatively simple life cycle. In fact, this is a life cycle that most people might typically sort of think of when they think of a life cycle, and it's very similar to the life cycle of lots of birds, fish and reptiles as well. The animal that we're actually going to see though is something very slimy. This is a creature that has a great big shell on its back. It is a snail, in fact, which is a creature that you might not actually know its life cycle. So we're going to take a look at my friend Turbo first. Let me bring him out of his little enclosure next to me here. This is no ordinary snail. He is in fact a giant snail. He is a giant African land snail, and he is really big. If I pop him side on there, you can see he's the whole size of my palm, a really big boy, coming up to about 10 or 12 years old, which is almost up to about sort of full age of these guys. He won't get too much bigger. When they are larger, they grow sort of much more slowly. Now, the first thing I'm going to do, so we get to see him hopefully in all his glory, is get him really nice and wet. Water is essential for these snails. They need it. They sort of absorb it through their skin, and they need it to make themselves get really nice and slimy, and that slime is how they move. I'll bring him right up to the camera so you can see he's a really big slimy boy. This down here, by the way, is a little bit of that orange there is some sweet potato that was in his enclosure that he's probably been chomping on, in fact. Now, like I said, we're talking about life cycles, and so we'll start off by saying that these guys, like lots of those other animals I mentioned, fish, birds and reptiles, snails lay eggs, and their little eggs are quite typical to what you'd expect. They're tiny little white balls, about the size of a sort of a polystyrene ball that you might find in a bean bag, and tiny little snails hatch from these little eggs, and they grow and they get bigger and bigger and bigger, but they don't really change throughout their sort of lifetime. So the baby ones are essentially really small versions of the bigger ones, and they're teeny tiny though, and so it does take them a long time to grow because they've got to grow this big muscular body of theirs. There's Turbo's face coming out to say hello. And they've also got to grow their shell. Now, growth and certainly sort of maturing has a huge amount to do with life cycles, because that's how it is. They often step up to becoming adults, and then certainly at the end, or when they're old enough, they can then reproduce themselves to create the offspring that they once were. Now, these guys, when they hatch from their eggs, they are these tiny little snails, and to get bigger and grow, they essentially eat. And these guys are typically vegetarian. They eat all sorts of vegetation, leaves and vegetables, as you can see with a sweet potato. These guys love courgette and cucumber as well. But they also need something specific for their shell. In fact, this is a really tough, hard material, and to grow their shell, they need the same thing that we humans have that builds our bones and our teeth. That's something called calcium. Now, we humans find calcium in things like milk, cheese and yogurt, but these guys, they probably won't be able to find much of that in the rainforest in Africa where they live. So instead they have to eat something else. It is something white like milk and yogurt. In fact, these guys have to eat bones. They eat the bones of animals that have died, perhaps sort of birds or any other animals around them that are on the ground and they've left this skeleton behind. They can actually slime themselves onto these old bones. They can eat the bones, and that's what they need to grow this big, tough, hard shell of theirs. And so throughout their life, they still need to eat calcium to grow this shell and all that other sort of vegetation as sustenance for their body as well, and all their organs inside. Now, because he's my pet, I have to give him calcium, and in fact, what lots of sort of snail keepers will give their snails is a cuttlefish bone. So this white thing here is the bone of a cuttlefish, and again contains lots of calcium that can give this guy what he needs to grow his shell. Now he's come out nicely, which is really cool, so we can see his face. And those two antennae on the top of his head, they are his eyes. He's got them raised up high so he can see all the way around and keep a lookout for predators. There's primarily birds that would love to swoop down and eat this guy, and that's why he's got this big tough hard shell. He can use it as his protection, as his home, his house, and that's what keeps him safe and hopefully allows him to get old enough to reproduce himself. If he does get scared or something is trying to gobble him up, he can tuck his whole body inside his shell, and that's what keeps him really well protected. I'll bring him right up to the screen so you can see these little antennae on his chin. They're his noses. That's how he helps find his food. Now, when it comes to eating and gaining sustenance to grow, he has a mouth, and inside his mouth he's also in fact got teeth. He has over 10,000 teeth in his mouth, incredibly small, on a great big tongue called a radula. Inside his mouth, he scrapes at his food with all these little teeth, grinds his food down, and that's how he eats. Now, when it does come to them being old enough to mate, two snails do normally have to come together. There are some snails that can actually reproduce by themselves, and that's called asexual reproduction, when you don't need a sort of partner of the opposite sex. Now, the clever thing about snails is because they're so slow, what they've done, which is really, really clever, is to help allow them to make babies more frequently, is they've made themselves both boy and girl. This means that when two snails do meet after perhaps sliming around for a very long time and taking a long time about it, they can definitely make babies because they both have the parts that you need to reproduce, and they can both go away and have their own babies as well. And like I said, they'll lay their eggs under the ground, in fact, under the soil, and they'll lay between perhaps sort of 60 to 80 eggs at one time. These are all these tiny little white balls that will hatch into those little snails, and they'll again eat and grow, become adults, and make babies themselves. So that is the snail's life cycle. A really interesting one, but also quite typical to, like I say, some of those other groups you might well know well, like sort of birds, fish, and reptiles that have eggs that sort of produce baby animals. They grow, they become adults, and they lay eggs themselves that hatch, and the cycle repeats. Now, we're going to say bye-bye to little Turbo, or Big Turbo I should say. We'll pop him away. We'll say bye-bye Turbo, because there are some other, I should say, slightly more interesting or sort of intricate sort of life cycles that we're going to mention, and these are some other animal groups. In fact, we're going to delve into our own animal group now. We humans are mammals, and us mammals, in fact, have a slightly different sort of way of reproducing, because we don't lay eggs. There are some sort of things in the middle like platypuses and the monotremes that do. They're sort of really weird animals, those platypuses with ducks of a bill and a sort of beaver's tail. But most mammals in fact give birth to live young, and that's a big difference sort of in the animals in general. You either typically do lay eggs or you have live young. And I mentioned reptiles before. Some of the snakes can give birth to live young as well instead of having eggs, but most reptiles sort of lay eggs. But the mammal I'm going to show you is one that certainly does give birth to live young, and certainly they do have quite a nice reproductive cycle, because there is quite a lot of development, certainly from a youngster into an adult. This creature of mine, this mammal, is something really spiky or spiny. It can curl up into a ball, in fact, to protect itself. I'm sure you've guessed it is, of course, a hedgehog. Now, these guys are nocturnal, and so he's under the sort of cloth at the moment. I'm going to bring him out, and he might be a little shy to start off with because I'm obviously sort of speaking in the day, but hopefully he should sort of unravel and reveal himself, and we can take a nice close look at him. He's gorgeous. His name is Piglet. He's a beautiful little African pygmy hedgehog. Now, let's bring him out so we can take a look at him. I'll just make sure I bring him out nice and safely. Here he is. This, everybody, this is my friend little Piglet. Now, like I said, it might take him a little moment to sort of feel nice and safe, and he'll come out. He also doesn't much like sort of loud noises, so I'm going to sort of lower my sort of volume just so we can hopefully see him, make him happy and have him come out and say hello. He's a beautiful little hedgehog called Piglet who will have a good sniff around. Hopefully you can see his nose twitching around there, and he should soon start to stretch his legs. He's pretty well behaved. And so here he is. This is my friend little Piglet. He's a gorgeous little African pygmy hedgehog, so a slightly smaller version and sort of more lightly coloured than the hedgehogs that we have in our country. I'll bring him up to the screen so you can see him there. There he is, having a little wiggle. In fact, what we can do is pop him down and see him stretch his legs. If I pivot this forward, we'll see him have a little wander around. And what I can give him to show you sort of one of the things he likes to eat are sort of bugs, and these are mealworms. I can place these down in front of him. He's going to come up. There he is. Let's try and swivel him around this way. Now, if he has a sniff over here, do you want one of these, buddy? He's having a good little wander. It might be better if I, in fact, just bring him back for a moment. There he is. He's gobbling around. I'll put some others in front of him. Here you go, darling. Doing this one. Always sniff straight past that. Let's see if he wants another one. Here you go, darling. Oh, he's off. He's more excited, I think, to have a little wander around on the tabletop here. But these are bugs, and these sort of hedgehogs typically are insectivores. In our gardens, gobbling up sort of snails and slugs, perhaps, as well as any other sort of bugs they can find. And like I said, what they can do is curl up into a ball. If I hold him up like this, I'll try and in fact swivel him around a little bit so we can see him. He can curl up. He's pretty well behaved, this one, so he's actually probably more excited to be out and about. But they can tuck their heads, if you can imagine, into their bellies to keep them protected. And they've got these sort of spines all around their body to keep them really protected. They tense their skin up, and so they really stick out sort of directly. I think he's coming up to the screen. Does he want to say hello? Do you want to come here, buddy? He's having a wander. You can just see his back there. He's just chewing down another little mealworm there. There's his little face. He's really, really cute. Now, when it comes to these guys reproducing, there most certainly is males and females this time, unlike the snails. And so the males have to come to the females, and it's the females that have the babies, which is often the case, most often the case with sort of most animals. There's the seahorses where males sort of give birth, but certainly most of the mammals, the females have the babies inside themselves, and then they'll give birth to live young. So these are things not inside an egg. And often the young of certainly animals like hedgehogs and other sort of rodents, they typically give birth to sort of really, really young babies that haven't actually opened their eyes. I'll try and bring little Piglet back so we can see him. There he is. They haven't opened their eyes. They still have sort of skin over their eyes, in fact. And they have to sort of basically grow up, and it takes them a few days to sort of have their eyes open. And also for hedgehogs, typically, they have to develop their spines as well. They have to sort of grow them out of their skin. Now there he is. He's really cute. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pop him back because he's probably dying to get back to sleep, and we'll continue sort of talking about his life cycle. His big tank is just behind me down here, so I'll pop him straight back in there rather than back in his little travel house. He's quite excited, I can tell, to be out in the day. Certainly having some mealworms for a treat as well. So what it is that they have for their life cycle, like us mammals, is they give birth to live young that develop, and often mammals do have sort of, I call them sort of baby animals that do have to mature. They perhaps can't walk yet like us humans. They perhaps have to sort of rely on their parents for food as well. Lots of mammals have to, the parents have to provide their babies with food, often suckling sort of to get milk. So in things like cows, but also lots of animals need milk from their mothers as well. And they eventually do grow up, and then they actually get to an old enough age to be sort of sexually mature, which means they can then meet a partner of the opposite sex and make babies themselves. And how it is that the babies sort of come out as live young is, if you imagine the eggs that we have, in fact, are kept inside ourselves, and they are incubated by our own bodies before it is we bring the baby out sort of as a live animal already. Eggs sort of are kept by females, in fact, and it's actually sort of the sexual sort of part of the male has to come inside, and they have to bind to create this animal and give them all the genetic material to make a new animal. In fact, that's a sort of simplified version of what it's like, essentially sort of the eggs inside ourselves that develop inside ourselves, us mammals, and then come out as a live animal. Now we're going to move on from mammals, in fact, into another group of animals that can also have quite an interesting life cycle, and certainly stages throughout their lives where they develop, and these are the invertebrates. There's very famous sort of invertebrate, or an insect, in fact, that has a very sort of cool development stage, but it's actually quite similar to lots of insects and invertebrates, and that is the butterfly. The butterflies you might well know, start off as caterpillars, and they have to eat a great deal of leaves, fresh sort of leaves, and then when they're plump enough and old enough, they actually cocoon themselves in a sort of cocoon or a pupae, and it's after a while of sort of turning into a soup inside this thing and reforming into a butterfly that they eventually emerge as their adult form. And it's as an adult butterfly that they can again pair up, mate, a male and a female can get together and make those eggs again, and the eggs are what hatches into a caterpillar that eats the leaves, grows and pupates into a cocoon again, and becomes another butterfly the generation after. That's a really cool life cycle of bugs, but it's actually quite sort of typical for lots of sort of insects and invertebrates. We're going to take a look at a really interesting invertebrate, in fact, one of my favourites, in fact, an insect like the butterfly, an insect that has loads of superpowers. This is something really cool that I like talking to people about, because most people actually really don't like these guys. Most people would consider them a real pest, but they are really cool. So we're going to take a look at my friend the cockroach. I think I've got Michelle with me here today, a female cockroach. Here she is, that's right. She is a Madagascan hissing cockroach. Here she is on my hand. I'll bring her right up to the camera straight away so you can hopefully see. There she is. Now she's quite big. The females can get quite big, perhaps sometimes slightly plumper than the males, because they carry they can reproduce, and the females are those that lay eggs actually in something called an oocyte, is what cockroaches create, and they develop into essentially tiny little cockroaches, and they basically get bigger and bigger until they do reach sort of sexual maturity. But with invertebrates, which is a term I've used already, these are the animals that don't have a backbone. They do, however, have bones, and they have something called an exoskeleton, lots of them. This guy certainly does, which is why if you could feel him, he's nice and hard and smooth. This is essentially like his bones on the outside, an armour that keeps him actually sort of quite nice and safe. But because this is tough and hard on the outside of his body, when these guys do grow, and as part of their life cycle, they have to shed their skin. So they shed their skin, and once they sort of wiggle out of it, they're actually quite soft for a while until their new skin or their new bones sort of toughens up and hardens again. One really cool thing that happens with the cockroaches is when these guys, oopsies, wiggled off my hand there, when these guys do sort of shed their exoskeleton, you can see the colour of him right now is really dark. Once they've shed, in fact, they're actually almost pretty much white, a sort of creamy white colour. And as that exoskeleton hardens, they become this really dark brown, almost black on their head sort of tone again. You can see the antennae at the front of her body there. They're like her ears, they're sort of wiggling around, listening in, sort of trying to hear sort of where things are, and also as sort of feel as she can touch the ground and sort of feel where to go as well. There's her little head. I'll bring that up to the screen so you can hopefully see. She is an insect, which means, of course, she has 3 body parts: a head, a thorax, which is like the body part where the legs are attached, and an abdomen, which is a fancy name for bum, which is sort of at the back of her body. Now, like I said, these guys are one of my sort of favourite bugs because they do have lots of these superpowers. Now, I'll tell you what a few of them are. Some cockroaches can be super speedy. Some cockroaches are so fast that they can run through fire. We can see her have a little wiggle on the deck here, actually. There's still some of the piglet sort of mealworms there, but we can see her have a little walk. We'll bring her back here. This is a nice sort of shiny tabletop, and she can have a little wiggle on it if she wants, but she might be pretty chilled out. The reason it is that we work with the Madagascan hissing cockroaches, like this girl, Michelle, I've called her, is because they're pretty chilled out. You can get some that are super speedy, as I was saying, and some are so fast, in fact, that they can run through fire. Some cockroaches can hold their breath underwater for about 20 minutes, a really long time for such a small creature. Some of them can be frozen in ice and then come back to life after because they've got antifreeze for blood. And loads of them can even live without their head. In fact, it's partly to do with their reproductive sort of cycle, because they have 2 brains, a brain in their head and a brain in their belly. So if they do lose their head, they can still use this brain in their belly to wiggle themselves around. And in fact, even without their head, they can move themselves around, find a partner and make some babies, which is really important. We're talking all about life cycles, and so we should sort of say that in fact most animals out there are trying to reproduce and create some offspring to live on after they're gone, in fact. And so cockroaches have come up with a really clever way to make it happen. Now, she's quite big, so she might not be able to show you too well, but they are really good climbers. Let's see if she can just hold on like that, sort of using these tiny little hooks on her hands and feet. She's quite chunky, and in fact she might well be pregnant. So their life cycle is laying these eggs in something called an oocyte that hatch into little cockroaches. They grow and they shed their skin, eating, almost anything with these guys. They can eat plastic and cardboard, glue, soap. They can even eat sort of poo is one of their favourite foods. They eat all this grub and lots of waste from us humans, as well as sort of fruit and veg I give them when they're pets. But they grow, they shed their skin, and they do eventually sort of get old enough to reproduce and make babies themselves. And how you can tell who's who, a male and a female, is there's slight bumps on her head, but the males, they have really much more prominent bumps that are actually called horns to help fight the males and actually sort of try and win a female to try and reproduce. Now, the stages of development that bugs go through are called instars. It's a bit of a fancy name, but it's you can have animals that, like the butterfly, in fact, that perhaps go through maybe a few different instars sort of throughout their life, and these are each sort of shed or development. They might have something extra, something new about them, like wings or new set of legs, or perhaps actually their reproductive organs to allow them to actually reproduce. And so the butterfly is a really cool example, but there's lots of animals that start out as a larval stage, something that looks a lot like a little maggot or a worm or a caterpillar, of course, and then they do often sort of change and toughen up in a sort of cocoon based thing, or pupae, and come out as a sort of a smaller version or immature version of eventually these sort of adult creatures that they are. So some have a very quick life cycle as well, like a dragonfly as an adult only really lives for a day, whereas some can live for a very, very long time, like cicadas in in America, in fact, can have a life cycle that they keep in their larval stage underground for 13 and 17 years, and then they come out above ground to sort of mate and breed just every 13 and 17 years. And bugs, they have really sort of, there's such a variety of bugs. They do have a wide variety of sort of life cycles as well. Anyway, he is one of my favourites. I like talking about the cockroach because of all those superpowers. But we're going to pop away little Michelle, because there is one more creature that I'd love for you guys to meet, and again, one that we should most definitely talk about when we're talking about life cycles, because they've got a really interesting life cycle, and it's actually a sort of a group that we haven't mentioned much about at all just yet. This is an animal in the group of animals called the amphibians, and you might know that that includes things like toads and newts and salamanders, but in fact we're going to take a look at a frog, a really cool frog. His name is Gulp. He's an albino Pac-Man frog, and he's a very cool looking frog. Now what I'm going to do first is so you can see that how striking he is. He's inside this little enclosure here. To make him nice and happy, I'm first going to give him a sort of a spray of water and try and clean him off, because he's often quite muddy. He digs down under the ground, in fact, lots of the time. You'll maybe see him sort of jumping around as well. He most certainly can jump. He's a frog and got those powerful legs. But then I need to wet my own hands, in fact, get them nice, because I'm going to bring him out so we can all take a little look at him. Whoop, here he comes, climbing himself out. This is my friend Gulp. Whoop, he's jumped off my hand already. I'll make sure he doesn't leave the table though. Here he comes. Whoop, jumping around again. Whoa, he's jumped back into his house. As you can see, I've saved the most exciting for last. He's having a real good jump around. Let me see if I can bring him up to the screen. There he is. This is my friend Gulp, who's very jumpy with those legs of his, but hopefully you can also see this big mouth of his. That's why it is I've called him Gulp. This guy takes huge, great bites of his food. Well, not bites, in fact, he wolfs it all down in one big bite. And then he pushes it down through his sort of throat and into his belly to digest. Now, how he does that is, hopefully you might also see that he's got these big eyes, these bulbous eyes that poke out of his head. Now, the reason it is that they're so bulbous is because they allow him to swallow. When it is he does push food down his throat, he's jumped back into his house there, he needs to push these eyes back into his head. If I poke him this way, you can see those legs working to push him around and jump around. He's also got his little claws there to climb as well. Woo, back into his little house. I'll bring him back out. And so you'll never see a frog eating with its eyes open. When they do need to swallow, back into his house. He likes this little home of his. He has to shut his eyes, push them back into his house, and that's how he swallows his food. And again, as we mentioned right at the start, eating and growing is really important when it comes to life cycles. Cool, he's having a good little wiggle around, isn't he? Jump around. Let me try and bring him back on the screen there. There he is, having a walk. But he can, like lots of frogs, jump a great sort of, decent distance. He's quite a big, fat, lumpy frog, in fact. Now, these guys do have a really interesting cycle, because on they do sort of lay eggs essentially, but their eggs are very different from what you might expect. They're not sort of hard or tough or brittle at all like the eggs that we know. Instead, they lay eggs in something called frog spawn, and that's often in sort of water. These amphibians need water for their sort of skin, and they lay this frog spawn in sort of huge, great numbers. In fact, they can create lots and lots of this frog spawn. And it's like a clear egg. If you imagine an egg without the sort of the brittle sort of shell part of it, it's like that, but it holds its form. So they're like little round balls. In the middle of this sort of clear jelly, there's a black dot, and that black dot eventually becomes something called a tadpole. That tadpole is eventually what sort of breaks out of this clear egg. Whoop, he's jumped into his house again, and that becomes a tadpole that can swim freely in the water. Now, in their sort of early days, whilst they're a tadpole, they need to be in water. They are fully aquatic. They breathe under the water, but they certainly have to swim as well, because all they are is essentially a head and a tail. Now, what they obviously need to then grow are their legs, and at the same time they lose their tail. So as they develop and get older, their tail gets shorter and shorter and shorter. They eventually lose their tail whilst they simultaneously grow these legs, which they then can sort of use to allow themselves to climb out of the water. And amphibians are so cool because they can live in water and on land, and that is the case for sort of all these frogs, toads, salamanders and newts. They can be aquatic and sort of land-based animals as well. And then they will essentially be small frogs, froglets they're often called, and they just need to eat and grow and get bigger and bigger until they do reach a sort of sexual maturity, and then they can have they can find a partner. Again, there are male and female frogs. They can meet a partner and they can reproduce to create some frog spawn of their own, some babies of their own. So again, they have a really cool life cycle as well, going through the frog spawn tadpole stage to a froglet, a baby frog, and eventually becoming an adult again. Let me see if he wants to come up to the screen. I'm a bit scared he's going to jump on the camera and make it all muddy, but there he is. There's his face, and hopefully you can see his big mouth. That's why I've called him Gulp, and those big red eyes. You can see him breathing there as well with his throat. Lots of frogs can croak, which is how they communicate when it is that they do need to find a mate. We'll pop him back in his house now, where I think he's probably happiest. We'll pop the lid on so he doesn't keep hopping around, and we'll set him over there. They do communicate as they perhaps need to help find a mate when it is they do want to reproduce as an adult, and so they make croaking noises and can sometimes communicate in other methods, sort of waving and jumping and waving their legs even if needs be. So that is the sort of life cycle of a frog, a really interesting one again. And we've been talking all about some different life cycles that all animals have to bring themselves back round to creating babies again that can grow and become adults that create babies themselves. And this is sort of something that happens generation after generation, and it's a really sort of interesting scientific topic that I hope you've enjoyed listening to me about. Now, all that remains for me to say is that I hope you've enjoyed learning about life cycles with me. I really hope you've enjoyed meeting the animals as well. They've been quite well behaved today, and there's been some really cool ones, even though they've been quite exciting. It's been good fun seeing the frog, the hedgehog, the cockroach, and the snail as well. From all of us at ZooLab, and certainly myself and all the animals in the animal room, we'd just like to say thank you, and we very much hope to be back out with you again so you can get hands-on with our animals too. But for now, thank you very much, and we hope to sort of see you again soon. Bye-bye. Hi, we're ZooLab, the UK's #1 for ethical hands-on animal encounters.